This is a Palm Beach Civic Association Community Forum, and we hold these regularly throughout the season to address some of the critical issues that affect the town of Palm Beach. And we've been doing it for years and years, and this morning's topic is Royal Poinciana Way. And we'll have our speaker address that in a moment. I want to thank Bethesda Church for letting us use this parish hall. It's wonderful, and they're gracious hosts, and we're very grateful to them. We have some candidates here today who are running for office, and while I'm not going to allow any of them to speak, I am going to allow them to stand up and introduce themselves. And David, we'll start with you.
Well, my name is David Levy. I'm the mayor of the city of Palm Beach Gardens. I'm running for Palm Beach County District 1, which is the northern part of Palm Beach. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here.
Thank you, David. Dina?
Good morning. My name is Dina Keever, and I'm running for Palm Beach County State Attorney. I'm a former federal prosecutor, and I have the endorsement of Karen Marcus, Jeff Atwater, Senator Marco Rubio, Congressman Clay Shaw, and ironically, the Palm Beach Post. So it's good to be here today.
We're coming down the home stretch, you guys. Just in case you aren't entirely worn out by politics, tomorrow at the Civic Association Community Room in the Paramount Building, we are hosting Adam Hasner, who is running to be our United States representative. And then on Friday, we're also hosting Lois Frankel. So if you'd like to come to either of those events, you can sign up in the back with Rebecca, and you can pick up a flyer if you like. Also, if you're having trouble wading through some of the issues, the ballot issues, the candidates, the Civic Association publishes a voter's guide that's specifically for residents of Palm Beach. And so if you'd like to pick one of those up on your way out, you're more than welcome to do that. We're very happy to have our mayor with us today, Gail Coniglio. Welcome. Good to see you. Thank you for coming. And Gail, you're going to introduce Adam Hasner and Lois at our two events on Wednesday and Friday. Thank you. And we have Town Councilman Bill Diamond with us this morning. Bill, good to see you. Are there any other council members here? No. Okay. Several months ago, when the Palm Beach Town Council was struggling with what to do about Testa's restaurant, Councilman Michael Pucillo was drafted by his counterparts on the council to figure out a solution to the problem of Royal Poinciana Way. Mr. Pucillo and his committee, which was made up of members selected by the council members, were assigned the task of doing what no other person or group had ever been able to do in probably the history of Palm Beach, which is to come to a solution that sort of pleased everybody and made everybody happy about a part of town that everyone holds dear. Fortunately, Michael Pucillo is just the man for the job, and we've watched him work over the summer. He is intelligent, articulate, and thoughtful about this issue as other issues. He is an attorney, and he is also a lifelong resident of Palm Beach, which makes him uniquely qualified. We've watched him in the meetings with his committee. He's patient and he's open, and as a result, his group's been making quite a little bit of progress in this area. So we asked him to come and update us today, the residents of Palm Beach, and we're very happy he's agreed to come and speak. And the plan for this morning is to ask him to give us a little overview and then to open it up to questions from the floor. Michael, we're very grateful to have you, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ned. Thank you, everyone, for coming. This beautiful morning. It's good to see also our potential county commissioners and state attorneys have an interest in what happens here in Palm Beach and some of our local zoning issues. As Ned said, I've got to leave at 11, so I want to go through a brief summary of where we are and have some time for questions. I think Ned very succinctly stated that Royal Poinciana Way is an issue that's been kicking around for a while, looking for a solution. And although I didn't volunteer for this job, I've embraced it and enjoyed it, and I'm optimistic that we will find a solution. We started the first meeting with what I think was the fundamental question that needed to be asked and should be asked in any body that's considering a zoning change, and that is, what do we like about what's in the given area? What do we not like? To me, that's the starting point of any discussion like this, It's not what does a particular developer want to do or not do, but what do we like, what do we want to see perpetuate, what are we concerned about, what do we not want to see continue there or be put there. It was clear after our first meeting that the residents like the historic, eclectic nature of Royal Poinciana Way. It is a collection of buildings that some of them go back 100 years. It was an original main street for the town back in the very early days. Some of those buildings that are there now date back to those days. Some were put in later, but they have a very historic quality. They're not necessarily landmark buildings in the sense that they don't necessarily qualify for landmark status. Many of them do not have some of the distinguished architects that have built some of the great estates in Palm Beach, but they're nice old historic buildings, and it just has a nice sort of Main Street character. And that was something that people liked and wanted to see preserved. Now, we also looked at what is the existing zoning in the area. And I've spoken about this for a while since I sat down and read the zoning code and realized that the CTS zoning district, which was put in March of 1980, is really a zoning that is better designed for a more suburban area. And specifically, the thing that I had great concern about, and I spoke publicly at some of the council meetings about, is that our parking requirements for commercial use are very, very intense. We require in the CTS district one parking space for every 200 square feet of retail. And that's just about what PGA Boulevard requires. So if you consider that from the perspective of, I'm going to take this as an opportunity to make sure my phone is off. Mine is off. I'll ask everybody else's. It's a candidate, so she's excused. So we have this situation where you've got one space for every 200 square feet of retail. Imagine if you've got a 10,000 square foot retail building, what that's going to require in terms of parking, or 20,000 square foot. You're up to 100 parking spaces. That is really directed at a suburban area. And as you've noticed, as you drive down the street, there's a couple buildings that really are more typical of the suburban type of development. That bank building with drive-throughs and so on are not really consistent with the historic quality of the street. So we felt that there was a need to try and get away from that suburban landscape and focus on something that is consistent with what we like, the historic character of the Main Street of Palm Beach. Reading through the code, it occurred to me quite quickly that the overlay concept was not an appropriate concept to pursue, but there were some things in our code that I thought really gave us the germ of an idea that might work, and that was the planned unit development concept, a PUD. And a planned unit development is, for those who don't know, is a concept in zoning where you give a set of rules and then you say within that area you can apply those rules with some flexibility. We have in our code, I think already about 7 different types of PUDs. One of those PUDs, PUD 4, we have A, B, and C, and then 1, 2, 3, and 4 are special exception PUDs. PUD 4 is a historic preservation PUD for residential properties. And those of you who were around back in the 1980s, when Warden House was converted from an old Meisner estate to a condominium at Seminole, will remember that, and that was the one time that the PUD-4 was used. And that was a time where there was concern that some of the old Meisner properties that were not in the residential areas, but were in more commercial, more densely populated areas, would be lost. And the concept was we'll use this PUD as a way of saving these and making them more dense condominiums, but saving the buildings. And it worked quite well, frankly. Warden House is still there. It's an example of the PUD concept working. So I said, why don't we try this in the context of a commercial mixed-use area like Royal Poinciana Way? Clearly, historic preservation is a big concern to the residents. If we can take this concept and apply it to a commercial mixed-use area and make it an optional means of development, PUD is an optional means of development. That means you have to apply for it. It doesn't automatically go in there and replace the CTS zoning district. It is in addition to the zoning district that's in place, and a property owner can opt to develop or redevelop under the CTS district or under the PUD-5, assuming we enact a PUD-5. And the concept was to try and get some preservation. So we asked Jane Day, our landmarks consultant, to take a look at the street and determine what buildings are contributing to the historic character of the street. And Jane Day produced a great report for us, which isolated those buildings that she thought were worthy of being deemed contributing buildings based on her actual research. There was also another report that was done by the Janus Group that was out there, and we looked at that report as well. And I'm going to read the opening paragraph or a couple sentences from Jane's report because I think it very succinctly states what we're trying to do with the PUD-5. She writes, the purpose of adopting PUD-5 is to create a vehicle that will result in those buildings that contribute to the historic quality of Royal Poinciana Way being preserved, at least in part, in any future development. Those buildings that do not contribute should be developed in a manner consistent with the historic Main Street character of Royal Poinciana Way. These characteristics are understandably more narrow than what could be developed under existing standards through the ARCOM process. So it is a more narrow, more rigorous approach, which has perhaps more limitations on it, but limitations that we want. So that's the basic concept of the PUD-5. We've identified the buildings that are contributing. We've required, or so far, the draft provisions of the zoning provisions that we've come up with require that any development be consistent with the existing character, architecture, scale, massing of the contributing structures. So new buildings, if they elect to go under the PUD-5, would have to be developed in a manner that's consistent with what's there. So, because if you look at the street, and I actually brought a map with me, we don't have an overhead, but you sort of can see they're contributing buildings throughout the block. They're sort of interspersed with non-contributing buildings, newer buildings. And the idea is we want it's one block. We want the new buildings to be in a manner consistent with those buildings that Jane has identified as contributing. Now, we're still working on the details in terms of this is a work in progress. We don't have a final product yet. I kind of hoped when I talked to Ned about this we would, but we're taking it slow and I think doing it right. So we don't have a final product and we're still working on some of the details, but we are looking at whether we should have percentages of buildings that need to be preserved, whether we should have facade requirements, whether we should look to our landmarks ordinance, which also has a lot of good provisions in it dealing with redevelopment of older properties. And hopefully at the next few meetings we'll come to some solution. This only applies to the 5-acre area bounded by Royal Poinciana Way and Sunset and Bradley Place and County Road, that one square block. It's 5 acres. It does not apply to any place else in the town. The PUD process, in the sense that there is in our code already an established process for developing a PUD, we don't have to reinvent the wheel on that. We have a very, very specific process that if you want to develop under PUD, whether it's our potential PUD-5 or some of the others in the code, you've got a process that you have to go through. You've got to go through the Planning and Zoning Commission. You've got to go through either ARCOM or landmarks, depending on your property. And you've ultimately got to go to the town council. So it's not an automatic. There's a lot of checks and balances in this process. So that's the basic outline. The two issues that I think are really the critical issues that have caused a lot of concern and discussion are density and parking. And I want to talk a little bit about density and parking because those are the two issues that I see critical to this process, and also, if we're not careful on how we deal with those two issues, we will not succeed. And I think it's important that if we do pass something, it's something that works. As I said before, parking, in my view, at least on the commercial side, was a significant issue in terms of what it was required. Now, density, the current density in the CTS district, where this 5-acre area is 6 units per acre. It's clear that density was somewhat of a carrot that we wanted to hold out there as some incentive to use the PUD-5, because we're asking people to come under a more restrictive zoning bundle of rules and embraced that, and we felt we had to give them some incentives and density and some brakes on parking were the two areas that we had to play with, that we had to work with. So we proposed that rather than 6 units, it'd be 10 units per acre, and with the ability to go to 13 units per acre in two specific instances. One is if you are reducing your density by 50% or more. And there's a couple properties on that street now. There's one in particular that's got 7 units on it. It's about density is about over 30 units per acre. If they went to 3, that would be an advantage. And I think that is a building that's been designated as contributing. If that were redeveloped and you'd essentially reduce density by 4 units there. There's another one you could reduce 1. So there would actually be a reduction in density, but getting down under the 13 units per acre. And just a word about the 13 units per acre. That number came from the comprehensive plan, which limits density in this town to 13 units per acre in the highest areas. It's a number that we picked for a reason. We also have 10 units per acre in the RD1 district. That's a number that is in the code. We also have 2 or 3 PUDs in the code that allow you to go to 13 units per acre. One of them, the PUD 3, allows you to go to 13 units per acre when the underlying density in the RD1 district is 10. So there's a precedent for this. If you go beyond 13, then I think you're getting into an area where it's not something that's sanctioned by the comp plan, and I think is clearly much more controversial. Parking. And this is the one area that I'm really pleased to have a chance to talk about, because there hasn't been a lot in the press about this, and when we got to parking at our last meeting at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there really weren't very many souls left in the room, because it was a long, difficult, tiring day, and we had to be there, but parking is really a critical issue here. What we're doing with parking is this. We are recognizing the notion of grandfathered parking for commercial uses. And the code, in its current iteration, and again, this could change, in its current iteration, the way we are drafting this is drawing distinctions between commercial and residential. On the commercial side, remember in my example, that's where you're going to get 50 or 100 parking spaces and curb cuts if we're not careful under CTS. So what we've said is, if you've got grandfathered parking there, if you've got a 20,000 square foot retail building and you've got no parking for it, then you're grandfathered in. And whether you redevelop a contributing building and save a portion of a historic building, or you do new development, you're going to get credit for that. Because what we're trying to avoid is this strip mall effect where we have massive amounts of on-site parking that really turns that from a main street to a suburban street. So we're going to give you credit for all of that. If you've got 10 spaces there and you're supposed to have 100, you're going to get grandfathered for 90, but you're going to have to reproduce those 10. Think about the old Daily News building owned by the Breakers now. They've got 15 units, or 15 parking spaces there. There's no residential there, it's all commercial. If they come back and ever redevelop that building, which is not a contributing building, it's considered it would be new development, they would have to replicate those 15 spaces. Now, they're also grandfathered in for a good bit more, and they would get credit for that. So the idea is to give you credit for the commercial. What about the residential? And this is a point that I think needs to be stressed. You don't get credit for residential. For example, that building I mentioned a moment ago that's got 7 units, if they tore that down and they wanted to put 7 units up, they would have to get parking for 7 units. Now, why is that important? Because if they come down to 3, they don't have to put any parking. So you're going to get a reduction in density. If they come under the PUD 5 and they can reduce their density by 50%, they don't have to put parking. And of course, the theory is if we've already got 7 units there with no parking, 3 is less of a burden on the town and on the on-site, on the on-street parking requirements that we have. So there's not a lot of flexibility in parking in terms of residential. And that may be something that we're going to look at and consider, but my own view on this, and I'm just speaking for myself, not my colleagues on the committee, My own view is that I think that that's important because we want to give incentives to get people to come under the PUD 5, and if you can just redevelop with whatever you've got and get credit for it, you're not going to have that incentive. So that's the parking incentive there. The other incentive, obviously, is on the parking is the underground parking. It's really only available to a couple of properties on the street that could realistically do it. You would get credit on your commercial, but if for all the residential you add, or all the residential you put on the property, I should say, you'd have to have parking. So getting underground parking in a couple of the large spots, I think, would be helpful. Obviously, the Testa property is the largest property in the street. It's 1.32 acres. If they did that, if they did underground parking, they'd be able to go to 13 units per acre. They'd be able to put some more residences. I have no idea whether they would or not, but I think that if there was a redevelopment there and you're able to save the old facade of that restaurant and perhaps build around it and perhaps have some residential units more on the back than on the front with some courtyards and vias, I think that would be a good result. Whether they're interested in doing that, I don't know. I think they're interested in seeing what we accomplish here and whether we accomplish anything. Briefly, I want to touch on a couple other points. Lot coverage. I'm going to get through this real quick and answer some questions. Lot coverage. We limited the lot coverage to 70% lot coverage. That's what's there now in the CTS district. We also required 30% open space. I feel very strongly that we need some vias and courtyards there. We obviously love Via Parigi and Via Meisner, and if we could have something that even is close to that there, I think that would be a very nice step for that part of town. So the 30% landscape open space is important, and by open space we mean available to the public, not putting up bars at night, areas where you can walk at night. We want to make this a pedestrian-friendly Main Street mixed-use area. There are many of them around the world. I'm sure people here in Palm Beach have traveled to many of them, and they work. People are there at night, they're there during the day, they go shopping, they go to restaurants, they stroll, they go into V's and Vias, and that's really essentially what we're trying to achieve. So we're limiting it to 70% lot coverage, 30% open space. A little bit of a break from the CTS district, which allows you to go to 2 stories. We've said you can go to 35% lot coverage on the 3rd story. Again, a little bit controversial, although you can get 3 stories by variance now. We've said you can go to 35% lot coverage. The inspiration for that is frankly all over the town of Palm Beach. If you go down County Road between Royal Palm Way and Seaview, you'll see a beautiful mix of 2 and 3 stories. Worth Avenue clearly goes, you see 3 stories, sometimes 4. So there is the ability to, I think, do some interesting things with architecture if you've got a smaller footprint on the 3rd floor. And a smaller footprint is, in my view, very important because you don't want massing of 3 stories. So thinking about towers and things like that, architectural details, we wanted to give a little bit of license to architects. And bear in mind, we're just writing the rules of the road here if we create this PUD concept. If someone's actually going to take advantage of it, they're going to have to file an application. They're going to have to go through planning and zoning. They're going to have to go through ARCOM or landmarks if it happened to be a landmark building. And incidentally, we're not excluding landmark buildings like the overlay did. And the reason we're not is, when I talked to Jane Day about that, she said, I don't want to exclude landmarks because we don't want to discourage people from landmarking their buildings. And if one avenue for redevelopment is not available to you because you're landmarked, you're not going to want to landmark your property. We want people to landmark properties that merit landmark status. So, and the final thing we're looking at is design guidelines. In fact, Jane Day is meeting with an urban planner today. We found a few dollars in the budget for her to sit down with an urban planner and possibly come up with some design guidelines. And some of my members of the committee have expressed a concern about having not just Jane's report about what's contributing, but also guidelines, telling architects how they want, how we as a town want future development there. The jury's still out on that. There's been some lively discussion among the committee members about whether design guidelines are a good thing or a bad thing. I think it depends on how enforced they are. We don't want to tell people you have to build this particular cornice or this particular angle or whatever, but we also want to give guidance to make sure that we get what we want there. So that's a very brief summary of where we are on the committee. I will tell you that it has been a pleasure to work with my other committee members who are diligent and committed. We are trying to gain consensus here. We're trying to come up with something that I think the vast majority of the town will embrace. I try and give everybody an opportunity to be heard, whether you're their committee members or members of the public, because everyone has an idea, and from these ideas, good things can often come. That's one reason why I'm here today. I might get some good ideas from you. So anyway, it's been a pleasure, and we're excited about it. I think we're ultimately going to reach something that I hope the community can get behind, and more important, that in the end, I think is something that works. Something that people really will say, years from now, gee, I'm glad they did that. And look what they saved over there. And I'm glad that new building looks like that and not like, something else somewhere else. And that's my hope, that we get something that works, that many years from now, at a forum like this, people will say, gee, they did a good thing back in 2012 or 2013, whenever it happens, in coming up with that historic preservation PUD 5. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions you've got. My pleasure to be here, and fire away.
Michael, explain to us what the process is. You just mentioned 2013, which I presume you're thinking your committee can finish your work by sometime during that calendar year. But then what happens?
Well,
it's not an official document yet.
It's a good question. Let me lay out the formal process. My committee's been charged with coming back to the council with a recommendation. Originally, they wanted us to do that in November. It clearly will not be in November. It might be December. I doubt it will slip past January. We will come back with a recommendation to the council. If the council adopts that recommendation, it will then go through the formal process in our code of changing the code, and there's some comp plan changes along the way that also have. This has to be put into the comp plan. And it will then go to the Planning and Zoning Commission, where the staff will help draft an ordinance. That ordinance will then be considered and recommended to the council. It'll come back to the council in the form of specific zoning changes, a specific ordinance to be adopted. The council will in January or December, whenever we get it, we will simply approve the recommendation and then put it in the formal process in our code for getting the PUD 5 created. Realistically, that could probably, I would expect that could be done by March or April. It's certainly my hope that by April of 2013, if this is going to happen, that it happen then. I'd like to not see it drag into next summer. Then there's a process, because there's a comp plan change. You have to go through the Department of, I forget what they call it now, but it's something, it has a sort of pro-development name in Tallahassee that has to approve this. Pardon me?
Department of Economic Development.
Department of Economic Development, there you go. So it would have to go through that, but I'm hopeful that that could be done by the end of the season in 2013.
Ask somebody else if there's somebody else. Have you looked at floor area ratio restrictions as maybe a way of keeping the height?
Well, we've got, lot coverage essentially is that where we're allowing the four corners of the building to go to 70%. Obviously, the actual interior numbers would be smaller, but that's essentially the way our code has handled the footprint, if you will.
Michael, there's a group in town that thinks that nothing should be done here. The government should not meddle in this, that this is a case of free enterprise, that let the chips fall where they may. We like it the way it is. We don't want any density changes. I mean, we read about this in the paper. I'm interested in how you respond to that kind of a...
Well, I guess my view is that the role of government, particularly in the zoning area, is to make rules that when change occurs, it's change that we like. As Ned alluded to in the introduction, I've lived here all my life. My parents came here in the 40s and started a business on Worth Avenue in the late 40s. I grew up here, and I grew up on Brazilian Avenue, not far from here. And I used to ride my bike around between Royal Palm Way and Worth Avenue. And I will tell you that that part of town looks nothing like it did when I rode my bike when I was a kid here. So change is going to happen. It's just simply in a free market society, you're going to get change because there will be economic incentives to do that. And that's a good thing because sometimes buildings need to be replaced and torn down. We used to have all these old guest houses, Australian and Chilean and Brazilian, little flamingos in the front yard and a couple of them. And maybe the fact that they're not there isn't such a bad thing. I mean, I look at where the Preservation Foundation is now. It's a beautiful building there. There was a fairly nondescript building there, and it looked across the road at the parking lot and the kitchen of my parents' restaurant. Now it looks at Beachhead. So change is going to happen, and I think we have to come up with rules that make for intelligent change and change consistent with what the community wants. If you simply take the position that don't change anything, change is going to happen anyway, whether you like it or not, in a free market economy. And I think you lose the opportunity to really shape that change in an intelligent way and in a way that is in accordance with what the community wants. So that would be my answer to those who make that point. Pat?
Could you, you get into zoning and you start getting into the alphabet soup of everything, PUDs and CTSs, but could you specifically address the applicability of what you're undertaking to other areas of town? What areas of town would be affected, people can claim that they should be affected?
Right. Good question. Well, first of all, let me say, I think a lot of people are concerned about Royal Poinciana Plaza, and I think your question really alludes to that concern. Precedent is a word that gets thrown around a lot, and it always doesn't get used in the way that it should. And as a lawyer, I sort of look at precedent in a very strict way. I look at it. Precedent to me is you have a given set of rules, and you apply those rules to a given factual scenario. And if the facts are the same, it's a precedent. If the facts are not the same, it's really not a precedent. And with respect to what we're doing here, is it a precedent for the plaza? The answer, in my view, is clearly no. Royal Poinciana Way has been there 100 years. It's always been a mixed-use Main Street area. It's never had any on-site parking of any substance. It's an eclectic group of buildings that have sprung up over time, over decades, and it's always had a secondary residential component upstairs and around the corner. The plaza is nothing like that. It was developed in the 1950s as a retail and commercial area. It has no residential. It's got 700 parking spaces, give or take, depending on whose count you use. So it's got plenty of parking. It's nothing like this. It's not even the same zoning district. CTS is the zoning district for Royal Poinciana Way we're dealing with. It's CPC there. It's a separate zoning district. And frankly, it's a zoning district that works. I think Royal Poinciana Plaza works as what it is, and so to the extent that I'm ever viewed as the drafter or the originator of this PUD5 concept, my view is that it has no application to Plaza. Now, does it have applications in other areas in the town? Maybe. I mean, we're going to put a 5-year sunset on this and see how it works if it in fact gets enacted. And I think that the proper course is to see how it goes over those 5 years. You talk about reductions in density and preserving old buildings. There's some older buildings just a little bit north of there on Sunrise that might be appropriate for something like this. The Palm Beach Hotel kind of comes to mind. You've got the density of 100 units per acre there in an old landmark building with retail on the first floor. You know, if you went down to 13 units per acre, you get rid of 175 units and you'd preserve an old building. That's a landmark building. So, maybe. But the facts have to match. The facts really have to apply for it to be a precedent. I think in terms of the plaza, the facts just don't match at all, and it's not a precedent for anything there. And I've said that publicly many, many times, and I will say it again. I think that's just a very different scenario. But I think if this works, we ought to look at it. I mean, one of the things that caused me to be concerned and look at the historic preservation concept in the commercial area is, you know, we're blessed in this town that we have these beautiful old residences by these wonderful, world-famous architects, and people will come into town and, you know, they'll spend $5 million for the house and spend $10 million renovating it, and that's fine because they're going to live there. But in a commercial context, you can't do that. There has to be a return on investment. And so we have to come up with rules that work to preserve our older commercial buildings. And that's kind of what's happening in my judgment, the Royal Poinciana Way. No one's put any money into those buildings for 30 years. Michael?
Will assemblage of properties be incentivized by this, do you think? Or what will... how will that be done?
That's a good question. I'm glad you asked. We are toying with the idea of putting a limit on the size that you could... I mean, I think, as I look at the map, you know, you've got just a colored map of all these various colors are all the different properties. So it's kind of hard to do an assemblage. But we're thinking about putting a limit, perhaps 1.5 acres or something like that. I don't want to put it below what an existing property owner has because I don't want to single out one property owner. But we're talking about doing that to looking at that issue and also requiring breaks in terms of the streetscape. Every 100 or 150 feet, you have to have a 15-yard break or 15-foot break in case someone does assemble big properties. So I think we are going to consider seriously, and I wouldn't be surprised if we come up with a size restriction. There's no minimum size restriction, which is a good thing because there are some very small properties here. The Main Street News building is it's got 2 residential units on top, and I don't have the size, but I think that's 2,500 square feet. I think that's probably less than a tenth of an acre. So there's no minimum, but I think there's a real possibility we may put a maximum just to avoid that possibility of someone trying to assemble the whole block and doing something that looks like City Place or something like that. Rhoda.
Getting back a little to what Ned said before, if nothing is done as a result of all of your work and everything like that, and things remain exactly as they are with the zoning, with the adherence to the comp plan, tell us the worst case scenario that can happen on Royal Poinciana.
The question for those who may not have heard it was, tell me what the worst case scenario is if nothing happens. Well, I think the worst case scenario is that the street gets developed in a manner that is consistent with the current zoning. And that someone throws up their hands and says, okay, I'm going to abide by the letter of the law and do exactly what your zoning code requires. And I'm not going to embellish on that by saying what type of establishments they would put there. Just stick with that concept. You know, if you put you take a 40,000 square foot Palm Beach acre and you put a 20,000 square foot retail first floor, which covers 50% of the lot, and then you're allowed to put 6 units per acre, so you could put 6 apartments on top. You now have a requirement for 113 parking spaces. Well, you can't fit 113 parking spaces on 20,000 square feet, so you're going to have to cut back on that. The Civic Association did a very nice thing for us. They hired Hedrick Brothers to take a look at what the zoning code provides for, and they calculate, I think, 62 or 63% of the lot would have to be parking. So you're going to have something that looks like 37% building and 67% parking around it. And, you know, it could be a great retail establishment or a series of establishments are there. It could be a not so great one. I'm not going to get into that. But whatever it is, that particular picture of 63% of an acre is a sea of parking lot. I mean, I tell people if you really want to see what the open space requirements are in the CTS district, go look at the Publix parking lot, because that's what you're going to get. And you're going to get that on Royal Poinciana Way. And that's not a good thing. That's what really kind of got me interested in this issue in the first place, is the fear that that might happen. And I don't want to sound fear-mongering, but that's what our code provides for. At some point, someone's going to say, okay, I'm going to go by the book. And that's what we're going to get.
In mentioning that there might be 2 underground parking facilities, how much thinking has gone into how they would access, where they would access, what requirements might be made in advance, or whether this is going to be left to the processing of the application? Because there are either ramps required or elevators required, and the traffic patterns will be affected. So what thinking and planning has gone into
Well, it's a good question. The first thing we've got is no curb cuts on Royal Poinciana Way, no curb cuts on Bradley, no curb cuts on county roads. That means Sunset's the only place you can access this. So if there is any underground parking, and I think 2 is probably the maximum you could get there, maybe 3, but I think it's unlikely. So what you would have is you would have access in accordance with our existing code, because our code's got a lot of requirements for this type of thing in terms of the size of the opening, a lot of building code provisions that would apply there. You would have to essentially access it through on Sunset. You'd have to have in and out. You would probably have to have some elevators there, not for cars, but for some other things. Obviously, it would have to comply with the code completely, but it would only be off of Sunset. It would not be on Royal Poinciana Way. I mean, that's one of the curb cuts on Royal Poinciana Way, and parking on Royal Poinciana Way is one of the things that I think are so antithetical to what we want there. I mean, if you walk on that street at night and you go from Sprinkles down to the next, I guess it's Cucina's, the next part, there's like a dead space because there's a parking lot there. And that's what you want to avoid. So all the parking, the access, all would have to be on Sunset.
My name's Harold Simon. You were born here, but I've been coming here since 1950. And I've seen the town.
You beat me by 3 years.
Yeah, well, you look much younger. So anyhow, and I think that what I've listened to this afternoon has been a very, very good explanation of problems in putting things in that, Royal Poinciana development there. But I think I haven't heard a mention, and probably read about it, but I followed it, the town council meetings and so forth, is what is the concept of what you want in this town and in Poinciana Way specifically. And there's a lot of changes that have occurred in the world. If I come down here now and I see all the vacant stores, I never saw that. Never saw that. The world today is online shopping. And I think that the need for these big stores, you go on them today, they're all empty. And I think the concept is you've done all the details, what you need to have in a specific area. But what is the general concept of what you're going to have in this area? I haven't heard really any description. This is what we want. We want something that's limited. We can only have 3 stories or 2 stories in the zoning code. But I think when I look at problems, because of my profession with medicine, if it comes to cancer, we want to solve cancer. We don't look whether we should have 3 MRIs or 2 of this or 4 of that. And I would like to hear a little bit more about the general concept.
Well, it's a good question because I didn't really touch on the uses. The CTS zoning uses in the town are pretty extensive. You can put a lot of various retail, commercial, business type establishments in CTS as well as residential. We do limit it. We adopt the existing CTS limits in terms of size, in terms of town serving. The 3,000 square foot. I think, frankly, the idea is that we want smaller buildings. The whole CTS district was put in 1980 out of a concern that there might be big box development. So we've got town serving limitations that were originally 2,000 square feet, now they're 3. Most of the retail establishments on that street are less than 1,000 square feet. And I think the view is that we want retail establishments that are small, town serving. And one of the things we may even talk about at one of our meetings is whether we want to reduce it from the town serving 3,000 square foot limit to something lower than that, on the idea that we're going to encourage more small, more town serving type of establishments that don't even need really 3,000 square feet but can do with 1,200 or something like that. That's clearly what we want. There's a couple of types of uses that we have specifically eliminated, which we don't think makes sense in that area that are allowed for in CTS. For example, houses of worship. Anyone who was at the last council meeting and heard the discussion about the temple will understand the theory behind that. So there are a whole bunch of other uses in this that are allowed in CTS that we don't want to have there. We really want retail town serving businesses. Now, having said all of that, the other point that I think you're making is in terms of the economy and buying online and the internet, it's a real problem. It's a real issue. And as I said earlier, with government, you can make the rules, and you can make rules that are designed to get what you want, but ultimately the marketplace is going to dictate a lot of what happens. Now, my hope is that we will create a set of rules that will encourage something that results in some town-serving establishments. I remember vividly the debate in 1980 when we adopted the CTS district about we want fish markets. We want fish markets. We want butcher shops in this town. Well, we don't have any more fish markets or butcher shops than we did in 1980. So someone's got to come in and open a store and rent a space and open a business. And that business has got to work. And that's something that we can't do. We can only lay out the rules. And I hope that this will be a town-serving area where there'll be maybe a fish market or maybe a nice gourmet shop or something like that, or this and that. That will keep having a wine store there. But ultimately, the marketplace is going to dictate, and we can, as I say, we can be as friendly as possible. We can try and make this work. We can design it, but ultimately, the marketplace, and that's a big challenge in every community. Hopefully, Palm Beach, we can get around those challenges because it is desirable to be here. This is in terms of a population, it's a population that merchants are going to want to serve because there are dollars to be spent here. But ultimately, the marketplace is going to decide that. Bill.
Is there any impact on the possible changes from the PUD across the streets?
I don't see any. We haven't really. You're talking about the Breakers PUD? Yeah, I don't see any. I've kept that separate. I don't want to be. They've already got their PUD approved. It was been approved since the 70s, that just those who don't know, the Breakers got approved back in I think the late 70s. It's been modified a couple times since. A development, PD development for some number of units in excess of 200, I think, on both sides of County Road. That I believe, it's a mix of residential. There's the ability to put a substantial number of residential units, and some of them, I don't know the exact number because I really haven't gotten too much into that. Some number could be on the south side of Royal Poinciana Way. Whenever I've talked to Paul Leone about this, the response I've gotten is we have no immediate plans to use that. I think it expires in 2025. I would be surprised if they don't extend it. My own view as an observer watching that situation is that it's an asset, and Paul, as a good accountant, doesn't want to get rid of an asset that has value on a balance sheet, but I don't think they have any desire to use that asset. And we're staying away from it. We are not, I've got enough on my plate with the north side of the street, but without getting into the south side. We're not looking at any transfer of development rights or anything like that. We're looking at that as completely separate.
You were asking for, I'm just going to give you an idea that we're...
I'd actually pointed the gentleman behind you, but I'll let you go ahead.
No. He's a resident, I'm not. Let him go first.
Mike, what's been the reaction of the proprietors to your plans up to this point?
The reaction of what?
The proprietors of the property.
Well, that's an interesting question. Les Evans is at every meeting, and I think Les is interested. He's got 7 units there that he'd like to develop. He's got serious parking issues. He tells me, and has stated publicly in the meetings, that he would gladly go to 3 units and reduce his density by 4. We'll see, but I'm pleased to hear that. Testas have really stayed out of it. They've watched, and I don't know what their reaction is. And that's really about it. I think everyone is sort of watching and waiting to see what happens, and not getting too excited until we produce something. Go ahead.
I was just going to give you an idea that's worked in Palm Beach Gardens. In the PUD process, we've developed a series of waiver justification criteria. And I was thinking what you could do is develop waiver justification criteria and make one of those justifications preservation of the current characteristics of the area.
Yeah, I think what we're doing here is even stronger, because you're talking about it almost as a variance factor is what it sounds like, and here it's much more of an emphasis that, I mean, we are saying, in fact, one of the strengths of this whole thing, in my judgment, is we have said you have to develop in a manner that I wrote it down because I wanted. This is what the code provision would say: consistent with the existing character, architecture, scale, massing, and placement of the contributing structures. You have to do that, and my view is that's one of the most important things here. Because frankly, if someone comes to town today and says, "I want to knock down this," they buy the Testas property, say, "I want to knock all this down, and this is what I want to put there." ARCOM can fiddle with it for a while. And ARCOM can say, "No, we don't like this," or "No, we don't like that," and kick it back a while. And then they may go to the council. But if anyone ever challenges us in court, I don't know how strong our ability to prevent someone using their property in a certain way is. And if you have a code provision that says you must develop consistent with the existing character, architecture, scale, massing, and placement of the contributing structures, and these are the contributing structures, you go in front of a judge across the lake, and they understand what that means, and they say, "No, this doesn't meet that criteria." This is a very specific code provision that says you've got to develop, and we've got teeth in it, I think, if we do this. And that's important, because right now, I've never known where exactly the result would go if someone ever really took us to court and challenged a denial of an application under our ARCOM standards. I mean, they're pretty good, but they can only be so good in a general context like that. In a PUD, you can be very specific, because we're trying to promote a specific type of development. It's one of the great advantages of the PUD concept is we're trying to do historic preservation of commercial property, so you've got to do this, this, and this. Whereas if you're talking about general legal standards on what you can build in a commercial area, well, the fact that it's a modern building, you may not like it, the judge says, "I'm sorry, you have to let them build what they want on their property."
Can you tell us what you consider architecturally significant on Royal Poinciana?
I'm going to tell you what Jane Day considers architecturally significant, because she's the expert. And that's an important question. It's the first question we needed to look at. I don't have her report, but I've marked up her report. The corner building, Evelyn Arthur, the John Hope building, Nick and Johnny's is next to that, the old Testa restaurant. This is a property, the other side of the retail property, the other side of the current gas station. The bank in the middle is not. The next buildings over are Main Street News. The next building, Cucina, is not. and the liquor store. The continuation of the Daily News building here is not, and the corner building is. That's Jane's report based on her research. And my view is rely on the experts there. And I think Jane's done a great job there. I think she has isolated, she's done the research. And that's obviously important for this.
Should we wind up one more question?
Yeah, take one more question, and then...
One quick question.
All right, then I'll let the lady in the back.
Parking, that's the real problem in terms of the spaces. I just, and with the current, what's happening north, and you've seen the flooding of underground things, this island is a very hazardous place to be. I don't know how to solve that problem.
Yeah, parking is a big issue. We tried to figure out a way that makes it no more taxing on the on-street parking that's there now. And we basically said if you're going to put significantly more residential, you're going to have to put underground parking. I mean, the advantage of underground parking, frankly, if someone's prepared to spend the money to do it, is it doesn't get people who come to the street for half hour, an hour. It gets people there for 8 hours. It gets them off the street. And then that opens up the spaces on the street. The people there for a half hour. And they'll open back.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for a wonderful explanation. I am a neighbor who lives on Park Avenue, and our street has shown in the years, which I beat you by 1945, has really come up by a lot of wonderful citizens. Someone unknown to me tore down that horrible building that was over there with something like 24 rooms in it, and people were being taken out by the police every night from that place. And they gave it to the town and made a park out of it. So I see great strides being made in a lot of the changes that are going on. I'm just concerned now with the impact of this change. I'm all for it, but I am concerned with how much of the surrounding area is now going to be impacted by these upward levels.
It's a good point. Thank you for your comment. I think at the end of the day, my own opinion, based on where I see this street being developed, I would be surprised if you have more than single-digit increases in density in the entire block. I don't think you'll see more than 10 units more than what's there now or what could be there. So I don't think it will have a significant impact. But you raise a point which is so true. At one point, Testa's had an old hotel there. And it was essentially the people who worked in the hotel. When my parents owned Petite Marmite back many, many years ago, there was an old hotel on Peruvian Avenue called Slayton Hotel that was on Peruvian that was basically a rooming house for the people who worked on Worth Avenue. There were others around town like that. You don't see that anymore. The marketplace primarily has dictated that they go away and that they be replaced by much more benign uses and much more citizen-friendly uses. So those things happen, and they happen for the better. And I'm hopeful, hopeful that we're doing something good here. Thank you very much for coming. It's been a pleasure to talk to you all. And maybe I'll come back when we get a final product.
Okay. Good job. Thank you all for coming. That concludes the program. Good job. Thanks.